welcome to the June 5th workshop of the Orlando City Council. Today we're going to have our annual legislative update. As you know, the legislative session just recently concluded, although I believe they will be back in session come Wednesday of this week for a special session, and it was probably one of the most contentious legislative sessions that we have had in a long time, and it was certainly a frontal attack on city government's ability to exercise home rule. So Kathy Russell, our Director of Intergovernmental Relations, is going to come tell us how much damage was inflicted. And Kathy and the team is going to give us a detailed PowerPoint presentation.
Yes.
And Kathy has been with the city for 27 years. How many years?
Longer than you have, Mayor.
Okay, longer than I have. And this is her first PowerPoint presentation.
Yes.
So it should be extremely entertaining and interesting. Kathy?
Thank you, Mayor and Commissioners. And I would like to start off by hopefully pushing the right button. And I want to introduce our team. We have several groups of lobbyists that specialize in different areas. So for the Peoples and Smith team, we have Bill Peoples and John Wayne Smith. From the Gray Robinson team, we have Robert Stewart Jr. and Chris Carmody. From the Southern Strategy team, we have Chris Dudley and Oscar Anderson. And then the newest member of our team is Jasmine Henderson, and she's got her biggest cheerleader here today, former Senator Thompson, who just happens to be her grandmother. So, this is our legislative agenda. I know the print is small, but we had 13 issues, and that's the difference between what local government lobbyists do and what maybe a private sector lobbyist does. Like AT&T may have one issue. We had 13 issues, and some of them are major issues. Other issues are particularly geared towards the city, where we actually try to get legislation to fix something for the city of Orlando. We really boiled it down to 4 major issues, and the first issue was to protect home rule authority. We had, as the mayor said, a really tough session. There were lots and lots and lots of preemptions. Some passed, including the big issues the team is going to present, but there were a few more issues. One was public works project contracts, charter school locations, operation of drones, and then there was a construction bill loaded with a lot of preemptions that even prohibited us from regulating the design and location of gas station signs, which, as you know, has been a problem near the airport. Some of the preemptions that will be back that we were able to kill were the vacation rental regulation, municipal election dates, and then local government towing fees. But the biggest one of all was House Bill 17, which prohibited local governments from preempting anything with business. And that would have been a $7 to $9 million issue a year. So now John Wayne Smith is going to come up and talk about the budget.
Good morning. Hi, I'm
John.
John. I'm a little nasally. I kind of was slow in getting what we typically call the post-session crud, but I'll do my best. Kathy asked me to do a couple things. One was kind of recap session in a general way, and then also kind of talk about some of the numbers. Some of those numbers will just be about the types and the number of bills, and then some of the budget. Recapping session, and I did a different version. We spoke to Metro Plan a couple weeks ago, and I promised Mayor Dyer I wouldn't talk about cones, so I'm not going to go through that analogy. But when you think about 2017 and you go back and think about in the beginning, some of it begins to make a little bit more sense. But one of the things I point out to folks who may have forgotten is before session started, in the House in particular, there was a major discussion about process and participation, particularly from lobbyists. We fit into the category of local government lobbyists, and so the rules and the things that the way that the folks wanted to apply some of these things They created a greater disclosure requirements, and there were some other things and limitations in terms of communications with some of the members. And in particular, it looked like some of the regulations and the things that they wanted to see disclosed were specifically targeted at folks who represent local governments. And so someone asked me, well, what did it feel like? What was session like? My best analogy was to say I spent 60 days in Gainesville, dressed the entire time in garnet and gold. It's just a little different, a little awkward. You felt in many times kind of out of place. And didn't say anything about who won the game, but just being there, it always seemed a little awkward. In terms of the level or the quantity of work, just some interesting facts. The number of bills that were actually filed this year were 3,052. The numbers are a little bit higher this year. The Senate filed 950 and the House filed 2,100. The biggest difference was part of the rule changes that the House made. 1,210 of those bills that were filed were appropriations requests. That was one of the rule changes that they made if folks had member budget requests that they file individual bills. Of all of those pieces of paper that were filed, at the end of the day, only 249 of them passed. There were 5 concurrent resolutions, 203 general bills, 38 local bills, 2 joint resolutions, and 1 memorial. One of the key bills that they always pass is the budget. And understanding the numbers, I think, is interesting. And understanding in the numbers in the context of kind of where we are in our state in public revenues also it can be entertaining or interesting. It was of note that the session or our legislature had in this particular fiscal year an increase in revenues in order to spend that were different from what their current year budget was of about $1.8 billion. Now that seems like a lot of money, but in the context of the last 3 or 4 years, it was actually about $1 billion less. So in many ways, the state had less money to spend when it came to new revenues, and keep in mind that 300 of that 1.8 was part of a BP settlement, and that had been spoken for, and that they were talking about using that primarily in the Panhandle with this particular trust fund. The other interesting thing to note is not just this year's budget, but the monies that we're supposed to have for next year. Next year, the state's financial outlook would say that we're supposed to have $118 million less than what we had to work with in this particular legislative session. Yeah, I didn't know I cited the technology yet. But it's not that interesting, these numbers. But the fact that we're supposed to have less money had a major impact in terms of how the state sat down to spend the 1.5 that they had. So at the end of the day, the final budget for this fiscal year was $82.4 billion, which is really, if you compare it to last year, was only $66 million more than the budget that we're about to complete at the end of this particular month. But how they came to do some of those things are fascinating or interesting, because it helps you see kind of what may happen next year. Some of the differences. In this particular budget, the state only spent of the 1.5 that they had in new money for general revenue, they only spent $600 million. So they're stacking some or putting some away, and one of the numbers that they use is they have a reserve fund of $3 billion for next year to help deal with the fact that they're not going to have a lot of money. But some other decisions that they made that they might could have done differently is in PICO this year, they did not bond. So when it came to public education capital outlay, they were about $200 million less than last year. Last year was the year that they decided to use bonding. Also in the education arena, they decided not to use $510 million from local property taxes. Now, the state's RLE, what we call it, the required local effort, operates a lot like a city or a county millage, in that it has a rate that was set in the previous year. And then as you sit down and do yours, you have a rollback rate, and then you do a budget, and then you have a proposed rate and things like that. And you decide at the end of the day what rate that you want to put in place. Well, in this particular instance for this fiscal year, the state decided to go to its rollback rate, which for purposes of how to spend some of the other dollars required them to spend more from the state's general revenue because it took $510 million off the table. And that's one of the reasons why we're going to have a special session. We're going to talk about that in a second. But those issues are some of the bigger decisions that were made that affected how they got to their end game. So people ask, and I'm not going to go through all the details, but who were some of the big winners? Higher education was a big winner this year. They got an influx of funding. The Everglades, if you followed Senate Bill 10 and the issues that are dealing with water storage.
And John, when you say higher education,
Except
those
UCF.
separate out
I will.
Yeah.
universities and
Yeah.
community colleges, because I don't think community colleges would
No,
share
they were
that.
one of the losers. I apologize for not making that distinction, but yes, universities were the ones that were the winners. Charter schools were in particular winners, and so were clerks of court, if anybody cares about some of the clerk funding issues, but they were one of the winners. On the loser side, in a general way, Health and Human Services hurt. Because we spent less general revenue in that area, it affects how much money we draw down federally. So we actually ended up spending less money this year in Health and Human Services than we did in previous years, including last year. Before we go into special session, economic development, I put in the category of losers. Our state colleges were losers, and the mayor, you pointed this out. In two different ways, I won't talk much about the policy side, but they did ding the state college system for $30 million, which they had previously put under what we called some of the developmental type assistance classes that were for folks who might not be quite ready for full-time or what we would call, full academic type college programs. So they had some remedial and some other things that they did for a lot of the students, and they've taken that $30 million away. The other key issue that I think would be interested, and you do have several community college, state colleges around this area, is Senate Bill 374 is going to handcuff some of the four-year degree issues. They put a cap on the amount of actual slots that some of the state colleges can have for four-year programs, and they put, in the future, prospectively, they put increases. They cap how much these programs can be increased. So for those two reasons, I had the colleges under losers. In a smaller subset of the budget under losers, I had libraries, I had land acquisition, which only received $10 million in total this year, water supply, and K through 12. Now, our governor and our leadership have had some meetings, and they're going to get together again this week, and some of those losers are going to be held harmless or are going to get some benefit. But as they prepare, there may be some other losers, and I don't know how to categorize this quite yet. But the governor vetoed $410 million total in projects, and we alluded to one of those that's an Orlando-based project. But I got a sense that when I see some folks on Wednesday that there are going to be a lot of members that may be unhappy, because in order to get this special session budget deal done, there's going to be a lot of political capital and a lot of personal effort that went into getting some of the monies for some of these projects. And when they get there, they're going to be asked to be able to do some really good things to help education. Education's supposed to get $215 million in the special session. Economic development is supposed to get about another 150. A new grant program to get 85, and Visit Florida to get 76. But something tells me that when everybody has to push the green button to do this on Thursday or Friday, whenever it does occur, that everyone's not going to feel all that great about it, because they know something that they worked on in a personal way is now in this bigger pot. It'll be interesting to see the flavor and the temperature of how some of these folks react. So that's what I was going to try to cover. I'll be happy to answer any more specific questions. Okay, my time is gone, Kathy said, so I'll stop there. And
Thank you, John.
see if you got
And
anything.
maybe we'll just hold most of the questions till the end. We can go through the process and then have free-for-all on the questions. Chris, you next up?
Good morning, Commissioners, Mayor. Well, those two entities drew a lot of attention this legislative session. The next slide you're going to see is largely irrelevant due to the special session called. As you all know, there was a displaced homemaker bill that turned into the larger omnibus bill dealing with Visit Florida, Enterprise Florida, and such. Much of what you see there in those bullet points are now gone, and they're going to take much of that up this week during the special session. The early version of the legislation has been out and been vetted. We have to wait to see how they're going to amend it, but early on it's $76 million for Visit Florida. Some of those measures are still in place. They've just been tweaked a little bit as far as what they mean, as far as Visit Florida engaging in business and promoting the state. But the governor gets a win there with $76 million, and then as well, while the incentives are not put back in place, there is this job growth infrastructure fund that's being proposed for $85 million. And what that is for public infrastructure projects or workforce training. It'll be doled out between Enterprise Florida and DEO. And what is infrastructure? It's pretty straightforward. It's roads, bridges, tunnels, any kind of facility that a city or another public entity would own. And then the ones that would qualify is anyone that's used to go after targeted industries, and that's the same list that DEO publishes every year for same QTI list. So I'm sure it'll have amendments between now and the end of that special session, but the early version of the bill has that fund largely in place with $85 million on that. And then, of course, there is solar energy or renewable energy. Last August, there was a constitutional amendment that passed on the ballot. Senate Bill 90 was unanimously passed in the House and Senate. The governor has yet to sign it, but most people believe he will. It provides an 80% property tax and tangible personal property tax abatement on solar equipment installed on non-residential to commercial property. And for anything that's installed after January 1, 2018, there's a carve-out for financially constrained counties, which we do not fit in. And there's also a carve-out for anything regarding Department of Defense, given that they have some federal mandates to get some renewable energy and less costs on their bases. But the thinking on that was, instead of doing 100% exemption, they wanted to give some of the local governments some skin in the game and give 20% back to the governments to encourage the permitting of these devices, so they could go forward, but still a large general tax abatement so that the commercial industry is inclined to do this. With that, we'll turn it over to Robert.
Thanks, Chris. Good morning, Mayor and Commissioners. A couple of property tax issues that you'll want to be aware of that came out of the session. The first, and John Wayne spoke a little bit to this, the session is often a conflict or a debate of priorities between the House and the Senate. And at the end of session, there's often trades that take place of, I'll pass your priority in exchange for you passing mine. One such trade that is worth highlighting was the super homestead exemption, as it was called by the House of Representatives, largely in exchange for the Lake Okeechobee restoration bill that was priority of the Senate. So that super homestead exemption, which is an additional $25,000 exemption off of your ad valorem, will go on the ballot in 2018. It's one of those things that, as you forecast out, it's hard to imagine it doesn't pass. There was an amendment at the end of session by the Senate to mitigate the impact of local government revenues just a bit by, instead of having $25,000 on top of the additional 50, it's $25,000 off the second 100 in value instead of off the initial 100 in value. So that did mitigate it a bit, but it's still a $600+ million impact to local government revenues statewide. Another thing you'll see on the ballot, and your constituents will see on the ballot, is a removal of the sunset of what was called Save Our Businesses 8 or 10 years ago. This is the no more than 10% increase in your property taxes for non-homestead property. This amendment would remove the sunset, so that you never have to come back and do it again. It'll be permanent in the Constitution if that were to pass. And then lastly, another one worth noting is an ad valorem exemption for the homestead of first responders who have a permanent and total disability, line of duty injury for them or for their families. And that passed unanimously, both chambers, and that will go into law as soon as it's signed by the governor.
Thank you, Mayor. Good morning, everyone. It's good to be here, and thank you to Robert for his work on the slides. They look great. I was asked to talk just a few minutes on transportation policy and what happened this year, and I will be brief. The first bill I wanted to talk about was transportation facility designation, Senate Bill 368. We don't usually talk about these, but there were 5 designations this year in Orange County, and some of them were very near and dear to your heart, so I wanted to kick through those. The first was a designation for Lieutenant Deborah Clayton Memorial Highway. You can see where that one is. The second was a designation for First Class Deputy Norman Lewis Memorial Highway. The third was Central Florida Expressway Authority designation for the Arnold Palmer Expressway. Fourth was a Sunrail Bridge to be designated in honor of the Reverend Kenneth C. Crossman. And then finally, a portion of 441 and Orange Blossom Trail for Annalee Cadet Way. So 4 distinguished Central Florida folks, and I wanted you all to see their pictures and see the portions of roads that the legislature designated on their behalf. Moving on, we had a couple bills of importance. House Bill 221, which has been signed by the governor, was what we all fondly refer to as the Uber bill. After 4 years of trying, the Uber and Lyft bill got across the line. The bill essentially establishes entities called transportation network companies. These entities are now preempted. Their regulation is now preempted to the state, and local governments aren't allowed to impose additional regulations or fees on top of them. It does allow airports and seaports to have regulatory authority over them to allow them to pay a fee to service that area and to have specific areas to park, just like they would for the taxi industries. It will require TNC drivers to go through background checks. It will require the TNC entity to be sure that they've done a check on the driving record of the individual, plus a criminal background history of the individual. The TNC will be required to do an audit, an independent audit every year to the Department of Financial Services that they've complied with the law based on the drivers and what they're required to lay out. So again, let me know if you have any questions on these. I'm just going to kind of quickly move through them, but that bill has been signed by the governor and is now law. Second bill is House Bill 299. This bill added a member of the Brevard County Commission to the Central Florida Expressway Authority. As you all know, the Expressway Authority is currently a 9-member board made up of 4 regions, 4 counties in this region. Brevard will now be the 5th region. Their chairman, just recently, this bill was passed on Friday, the chairman has already appointed Brevard County Commissioner Jim Barfield to serve on the Central Florida Expressway Authority, and that starts July 1st. House Bill 1049, this was a significant bill dealing primarily with the Miami-Dade Expressway Authority. There were 4 or 5 bills dealing with the Miami-Dade Expressway Authority, one of which to abolish them completely. This bill puts some significant restraints on the use of their funds, what they're allowed to do, how they're allowed to raise tolls, their transparency. The reason it's on this list for you all here is one provision of this bill specifically deals with express lanes, and there will be some statutory limitations on both the department and the Florida Turnpike Enterprise on when they can implement variable pricing tolls in express lanes. It will require them to use some national engineering standards before they're able to do that. Moving on, House Bill 865, which was signed by the governor last week. This was the big DOT package. Not a ton to report here for you other than one, it creates the Florida Smart City Challenge Grant Program, which was something that was important to us. That program helps support and incentivize emerging new technologies. The legislature appropriated $325,000 for the program, but that was vetoed on Friday. So the program's in statute. There's no funding there. It will also allow the department to sign up for federally authorized pilot programs that would give them a flexibility if they want to study safety or congestion issues in a specific area or region without having to go back to the legislature for specific approval. And the final bill was House Bill 695. This bill was primarily a South Florida Transportation Authority tri-rail bill. It put some regulatory requirements around the money they can spend. It's on this list because a key provision of this bill extended the liability indemnification protection for the All Aboard Florida program that we sought for Sunrail and got to allow us to operate on both government and CSX lines without having the indemnification in place. So they sought the same protections we did. So Oh, and lastly, red light cameras. I forgot about those. Always a fun fight that we've done every year. This is one of Kathy's favorites. Glad to report that while the House yet again passed the repeal of the Mark Waddell Traffic Safety Act, the red light cameras, the Senate bill was defeated in the first committee of reference by a tie vote of 2-2. So that bill died and didn't proceed for the remainder of session. That's it. And Oscar Anderson will come up and talk about housing.
Chris, there's a slide in here that has a new Secretary of Transportation been appointed.
It shouldn't.
Oh, okay.
There will be at some point there.
Okay.
Morning, everyone. Mayor. Wanted to talk for a moment about housing. I'll keep it very brief. As you know, there was big homeless legislation passed last year that gave some more flexibility to local governments. This year, there was about $250 million in total in affordable housing funding that was passed by the legislature. About $150 million of that was for production of new units, which is what they call the SALE program, and then about $100 million for the local governments to use. Of that $150 million, there's two things that I want to point out that were different. One, there was an increase in the amount of money available for what they call workforce housing projects, up to $40 million this year. And then there is $100,000 for this task force for affordable housing, which I'll talk about in a minute. Subsequently, under the SHIP funds, which the city gets funding from, that I referred to, that the homeless legislation talked about, there's the $100 million. There's a chunk again that goes towards homeless programs specifically from last year, continuation, which is important, and then the Catalyst program, which is again sort of technical assistance for entities trying to build and produce affordable housing. On one note that's not a slide that I wanted to talk about, there's an issue right now related to gap funding, and there are a couple of affordable housing projects here in the city, and I've had some conversations with Brooke about this, and it looks like Florida Housing is going to get the flexibility it needs to solve a problem. The way tax credit programs work, those projects get a tax credit allocation. They go out to the market and try to sell them. Because of uncertainty at the federal level, the value has gone down, so the amount of capital generated by those tax credits is less, and so it's created this gap in these projects to make these projects work. And so we have been working with Florida Housing Finance Corporation specifically to try to give them the flexibility. And the governor's office has to say, you can do this, essentially. And we've all been having a lot of conversations about that. It looks like that should happen in the next week or so. So that'll be good for those projects here locally. As a part of the budget, the implementing bill was passed, and there was some language tucked in there related to this work group. The Senate Appropriation Chairman, Jeff Brandis, from Pinellas County, filed a separate bill to create this work group, and then he ended up tucking it into the budget bill itself. It does one thing that's interesting is that it's focused more on land use regulations and barriers to affordable housing, sort of the old NIMBY stuff that we used to have before when the market got heated. The makeup, which the governor gets to appoint, will include obviously the executive director of Florida Housing, 5 members from the governor, and you can see how they're outlined as what the members should be. 2 from the Senate President, 2 from the Speaker, local government representation from the league and the counties, and then also the chair of the Building Commission, or their designee, which is sort of that, is there a building code issue that's keeping affordable housing from happening? The purpose of it is to kind of do a general overview of what's going on in the market now, whether it's market rates, whether it's affordable housing units, look at building codes, look at what the public sector is doing, what the private sector is doing. It's sort of a generic look at the affordable housing industry in Florida. The challenge is going to be that they have to come back by January 1st with a report, and they're supposed to start by September. And having been, in my previous life, I was chair of the Affordable Housing Study Commission, and it's going to be hard. They're going to be meeting twice a month, 3 times a month in order to get some sort of product that's worth anything to the governor's office by January. One challenge for next year, as I wrap up, that's going to be interesting is this year there was what they called guarantee fund monies in the SALE funding, which is $113 million of it ended up using to help backfill the SALE funding. Those monies are going to go away next year. So next year we're going to have a much bigger challenge on getting those state housing trust fund dollars to stay where they're supposed to be and not be swept by the legislature. They sort of had this ability to backfill it this year, and they're not going to have that next year. So it'll be a bigger challenge to keep those numbers up at that $250 million total for affordable housing. Okay. Who's next? Public records. It's not you, Bill.
Not yet, but I'm going to be brief. There are two public records issues that I'm going to cover today. The first is Senate Bill 80. Now, this legislation was written in order to address the rising number of people that were filing public records for the sole purpose of filing a lawsuit against an agency. It's really written to mitigate the exploitation of the public records laws that we enjoy in the state of Florida. What Senator Stubbe found, like I said before, was there's a rising number of people that were going and, making obscure public records requests solely so they could sue the agency and get the state attorney's fees. So this legislation clarifies that and maintains the award of attorney's fees to plaintiffs, but it states that the plaintiffs must file a written request with the custodian of the agency at least 5 days before the filing of the action, which gives them sufficient time in order to respond to the request and fulfill it if it is something that is valid. Alternatively, it creates attorney's fees that may be awarded to the agency if the court finds that the public records request was filed for an improper purpose. And they define improper purpose as something that was primarily based in order to get the attorney's fees or to file an action, or something that was a request that was frivolous or obscure. Another issue that we worked on this year was House Bill 111. That was filed by Senator Bracy and Senator Cynthia Stafford in the House. And this legislation was particularly important to Commissioner Hill, and we worked with her on the bill in order to make the information related to the witness of a murder exempt from public records and confidential. And what's special about this legislation is not only is it exempt from public records, but the exemption and confidentiality stays with the information once it is disclosed during discovery to the defendant and the defendant's lawyer. This is especially important given the murder of Lieutenant Clayton. There were several witnesses who were afraid to come forward, and the bill was written in order to make those witnesses feel more comfortable participating in an investigation and giving information to the police. So these were two public records issues that we wanted to cover, and I can answer any questions at the end. I think it's you this time.
Mayor, Commissioners, I'm Bill Peebles. I have the home rule. Look, we're already there. I have the home rule section, which I guess is fitting, is that I've toiled in that vineyard for a long time. The environment was as harsh as it has ever been. It was just awful, as Mayor Dyer alluded to earlier, to be a local government or a local government lobbyist. And most of that emanated from the Florida House. The House was where the ad valorem exemption, the additional homestead exemption began. The House was where House Bill 17, which we all called the super preemption, began. The House was where Community Redevelopment Agency legislation began. That's the first one I'm going to talk about. There was a House bill. It was a Speaker's priority bill that would have essentially eliminated community redevelopment agencies. It did everything but. It grandfathered CRA payments for debt, for outstanding debt, but it prohibited the creation of new CRAs, and it prohibited the expenditure of any funds by a CRA after October 1, 2017. So it could have been worse, but not by much. And that's sort of true for everything we worked on this session. It could have been worse, but not by much. The CRA thing came about as a result of two things. There have been over the last 4 years a grand jury report, an Auditor General's report, and an OPAGA report, which is the Legislative Policy Study Commission, all of which found some flaws in some CRAs and made some recommendations about how things might be handled better. The House, though, went way beyond what was in any of those three reports And the reason they went so far is because they saw CRAs. The House was on course to eliminate anything that smelled or felt like corporate welfare to them. Anything where government was spending money to help any kind of business. And CRAs felt like that to the House. And so this was genuinely an ideological position that the House held. The bill as it was filed was as bad as it could be, as I said. It got better over time. By the time the bill passed, there was a requirement that if you're going to continue a CRA past 2037, you would have to get a majority of the commission plus one to renew the CRA anytime between now and 2037. And there was a requirement that new CRAs could only be created by special act of the legislature. Otherwise, we largely mitigated the worst parts of the House CRA bill. But while we were getting there, the bill came up in the Senate, and because the bill had not really made any progress at that point, we worked hard. A lot of people worked really hard to kill the bill in the Senate committee, and we were successful. The bill died in the Senate TED Appropriations Subcommittee on, I think, a 6-3 vote. So it was a pretty strong statement that the Senate, at least, was not interested in a wholesale gutting, really, of CRAs. Now, there is interest in some reform, and that'll be back next year. We're already talking to some of the folks who were interested in that issue this past year about what it might look like instead of sort of the meat cleaver approach that was taken this past year. This is a sign of the end time. Municipal local option transportation surtax. We've talked about this for several years, and finally we got to break out into the open. It was fun for a minute. It provides the amendment, because it was amendment to the to the Department of Transportation's bill package. The amendment provided that two cities in the state of Florida, Tampa and Orlando, could levy what's known generally as the Charter County Transportation Surtax. Both of those cities are located in counties where the county-wide surtax referendum has failed in the past. Tampa and Orlando are both willing to ask their voters if they would approve a 1-penny surtax. Senator Simmons here and Senator Latvala from over around Tampa Bay were wonderful champions for us in the Senate. In the Senate Appropriations Committee, the amendment to authorize Tampa and Orlando to go to referendum on this penny was adopted by the Senate Appropriations Committee. It became a part of the transportation package. At the very end, as the Senate prepared what they thought would be the final transportation bill to send over to the House balked at accepting this. Now, we had previously had asked the governor if he would approve this, and he said as long as there was a referendum on it, he was okay with it. And we had asked folks in the House what their view was of it, and while nobody ever really reached out to wrap their arms around it, nobody ever said no either. And so we sort of pushed as hard as we could, and at the end of the day, people in the House just said no, don't send that over here, it'll kill the whole bill. And our Senate sponsors asked us to respect that and respect the bill sponsor and the department, and that's what we did. So the amendment, the 1-penny surtax, never did go to the Senate floor or to the House, but we did. It was sort of fun for a while, as I said. We are farther along now than we have ever been on this issue, and I'm encouraged at the progress we made this year. I don't think there's any reason to give up. Small cell wireless attachments. AT&T and Verizon in particular are in the middle of a national effort to roll out the facilities necessary for 5G cell phone technology. The facilities are large. They're not small, although they call it small cell wireless. They're big. They're as big as a refrigerator, as big as a suitcase. They're not macro towers like you're used to seeing. They're micro towers, and they want the authority, and in Florida now have the authority to attach to your street lights and your traffic signs. The big fight was over the conditions under which we could say no, and we did pretty well there. We got a good number of ways that we can say no. The second big fight was over what we could require them to look like, because as profit-driven entities, they're not going to make these things pretty if nobody makes them. And we have, under the bill that passed, we do have the authority to impose standards that so that they meet the local context. We can impose color, stealth, and concealment requirements on these facilities. And those, just so you know, were modeled on your ordinance. What we asked for in that legislation was modeled on the Orlando ordinance. So the outcome on that bill was not as bad as it might have been. It was not as good as I had hoped. The House had consistently talked about being free market driven and adhering to free market principles, and it turned out that meant unless local government's involved, because there is a price there is a market for the attachment of these facilities to your street lights and your traffic signs. And nationally, it's between $1,500 and $2,500. And we argued vigorously right until the last minute that you can't say that you're market oriented and then put a price on what cities can charge for attachment to these facilities. And they all just sort of looked the other way and said $150 is what we're going to let you charge, about 1/10 of what the market would be. I think that's all I got. Yep. Thank you.
This is the show me the money section. Unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to show you as much money as I thought. We thought we would stand here today and tell you we got $3.9 million for the Performing Arts Center. Unfortunately, the governor vetoed that on Friday. And the reason for that is most of the projects going to higher ed that are pass-through projects that go to another entity, he vetoed as part of the plan to give more money to higher ed to increase graduation rates and those types of things, which are good things. This money was originally put in the UCF budget by Senator Gardner as part of his legacy. And the reason it was put in the budget, it was the base budget of UCF, and it made it veto-proof. Unfortunately, that did not hold. The House leadership had singled this out the entire time, and it was never in the House budget until the very end when the Senate prevailed. Mayor Dyer had also worked closely with the governor, who was supportive of this issue. So the tide has turned. It's not done. There is a special session. If there's any way that possibly we can restore this project, which is a public project, it definitely has impact regionally in the state and is economic development, we'll try and do that. The second appropriation was the Florida Children's Initiative, and that's Lisa Early's PKZ program, which she has partnered for several years with Jacksonville and Miami to replicate this program statewide. They had to go through the appropriations process. They wanted a lot more money. They wanted $3.5 million. There was so much competition, but we had support from Senator Simmons, Bracy, and Anton, who weighed in and were able to get $600,000, which will be divided between these programs. There are two other pass-through programs to UCF, and both those pass-through programs were not vetoed by the governor. The first one was the post-traumatic stress syndrome program. It was never in the budget, and several of our Democratic legislators, including Representative Smith, Senator Stewart, and then Mike Miller, wanted to get that in at the end, and so they traded other issues they had, and they did receive the $2.5 million. And the next one is the bridge project. That is the sensor project in Osceola County for $4.5 million. That being an economic program, the governor did not see fit to veto that. And then the last program was homelessness, because that's such an important issue for us. Several years ago, we worked a deal, the local governments, that out of the dock stamp money, the Sadowski money, that we would get a guaranteed $4 million off the top that would go to our local continuum of cares, and that did prevail. Looking ahead, never say die. We are going to go back with the municipal local transportation surcharge, and there are several excellent reasons for doing that. The first one is it raises between $70 and $80 million a year for transportation in the city of Orlando if the full penny was passed. The second reason is it can be used for construction, but it can be used for operation. You could use it for links. You could use it for Sunrail. You could connect Sunrail to the airport. And it's going to receive strong opposition from the House again. It's got the T word, the tax word. The irony is there's 31 counties that already have this. Some are very, very small. And why you would not give this type of funding to urban areas that have the transportation needs does not really make sense. The next issue is the restaurant alcohol beverage license, and this was an interesting issue for me because I had to go to all the House and Senate regulation meetings, and all they talked about was alcohol. They talked about the craft beers and giving free glasses away. And so it was fun to be in there. And what we tried to do, we have a unique market in downtown Orlando for restaurants. We have small boutique restaurants that need help. We've actually got fewer restaurants in this area, the mom and pops, because they have to compete against large chains. Large chains restaurants want to have a standalone like Red Lobster, where they have plenty of parking that you see the restaurant from when you're driving by. You can't do that downtown, and these small restaurants have to pay more rent. So what we thought, the staff came and said, could we do full service alcohol? Well, right now the requirement is you have to be 2,500 feet. You have to be able to serve 150 meals at one time. We wanted to lower that to 1,800 and then 100 meals at one time. We were too late to get it as a local bill, so lo and behold, the Department of Business and Professional Reg wanted us to put, and they put the language in the bill for us. I went to the first committee meeting. I was so excited. It got ripped out. What it was, the liquor store owners that pay $300,000 for a license did not want this going statewide, that anybody could do this wherever, because they felt like it would be a regulation and an enforcement problem. But what they did offer us is to come back with a local bill. So we plan on doing that next year. Jacksonville has used that model where we could decide on a portion of downtown where we want to do it. We did talk to a couple of restaurants downtown. They were ecstatic if we could do this. And then Lisa brought a problem with DC Department of Children and Family Services licensure of after-school programs. She's required for our after-school recreational programs to be licensed as a child care facility. And that's really not what they're doing. They're just doing recreational programs after school, much like they do the summer programs. But she has to get duplicate level 2 background checks. She has to get duplicate health and fire, all the inspections we do for the building. She has to do that twice because DCF will not accept our documentation. They did not want to do this statewide because they're feeling like Orlando does such a good job. We do our background checks. We do inspect our buildings. Maybe that doesn't happen across the state, but they're willing, and Representative Brown and Senator Stewart filed this bill. Representative Brown has pledged to continue over the summer to meet with DCF and see if we can maybe do this through regulation and not a bill, but either way we will proceed. So that ends our presentation, and we're available for questions.
Thank you, Kathy and team. Questions, comments? Commissioner Hill, then Commissioner Stewart.
Thank you, Mayor. I had one or two questions. One was, Chris, could I get, Chris, yeah, may I get more, you don't have to come up, but can I get more information regarding that infrastructure workforce training program that you mentioned earlier? Sure. Come on up.
I think we're all in the same boat on some of this. It's the legislation has been proposed. Paul Renner, who ran the original legislation dealing with Enterprise Florida and Visit Florida, is going to be the House member running this legislation. The long and short of it is it's about 2 pages worth of legislation that creates this fund. It specifically targets public infrastructure to attract targeted industries or job workforce training to attract targeted industries. And it makes it clear that it has to be publicly owned infrastructure. If it is going to be leased or sold, it has to be for fair market value. But what is not clear is it says targeted industries, and DEO is required under statutes now to create a list of targeted industries based on, I believe, 6 criteria. And so every year they publish that list. I was looking at the more recent list just to see where it's at, but I don't know when that most recent list was published and when Sissy Proctor at DEO and her team would publish a new list that could maybe attract or list things or industries that City of Orlando is interested in.
Thank you so much.
Sure.
Thank you for your work. I had a question regarding the Uber, now that the state is going to be the ones that's regulating that. Are we going to allow for airport pickup? I know that was one that isn't allowed. Will that continue?
We have no ability to regulate whatsoever, and the airport is proposing a new set of rules related to ground transportation that they're doing public hearings on currently, so they're trying to figure out exactly where they're going to have Uber pickup.
Okay, thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mayor.
Great job, everyone. I just want to also commend Jasmine and the Pittman group, and also council in your leadership, Mayor. I remember last year this time when you all came to give us a session update, and I was here broken and distraught, actually, and asking for your assistance on the next session, and you all came through, and not only does it lighten my load, right? And no, it isn't closure for me, but knowing that this bill is going to go out and help families and law officers throughout the state of Florida, it brings me silence. So I really like to thank you all for bringing this to pass, and Jasmine and your group for all your hard work. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Stewart.
Great, thank you. John Wayne Smith, where are you? Did I lose you? All right. I've got a couple of quick questions on this general state budget, and I guess I'm probably a little bit confused as to how we can project next year that we're $129 million short of what this year is. I mean, what's going on in that projection? I'm just trying to understand it.
Well, the way that the state has an economic development estimating arm. They do a 5-year financial outlook. And whenever they sit down to do any of their particular revenue estimates, they do it on a 5-year horizon. And so we have, when they sit down to do the budget, they do one of their estimating conferences like a month out so that they have the most accurate information. So we know the best numbers or the best data that we have is for the fiscal year that they're sitting down to do. But they also give us estimates for the next 4 out years. And part of that, and we have seen this outlook for a while. People just haven't talked about it, but we know for the next fiscal cycle that they're projecting that we're going to be basically flat or $118 million less than what they projected to have for this budget cycle that they just did. Now, it's hard to explain all of the nuances behind that, because there's many aspects of our economy that are extremely strong. But one theory is that we came out of the recession and kind of ramped and we sprinted. And so now it's kind of like, okay, we got really tired, so we're just kind of like not really slowing down, but we're plateauing a little bit, and then we're expected to ramp again in the out years. But there's going to be this little blip that's affecting the budget decisions that they're making right now.
Thank you, John.
Sure.
Just because the economy in Florida has been so strong, and because tourism has been so strong,
Right.
it just strikes me as crazy that that's the case. I just can't imagine us not having a significant increase in just sales tax revenue for the state of Florida.
Sure. Actually, the sales tax keeps going fairly
Yeah.
consistent and strong. One of the other mechanisms that contributes greatly to our general revenue, it's the second biggest contributor, but it does impact, and it's more cyclical, is dock stamps. Dock stamps has a bunch of earmarks like land acquisition and Sadowski and other things, but still about half of it is dedicated to general revenue, and for whatever reason, it's very cyclical, and it's one that is up and down quite a bit. It has been on the uptick, and we've had a lot of refinancing. Real estate's been coming back, but it has also plateaued because of a lot of our refinancing and a lot of those other things from the recession have kind of worked themselves out. So until it gets like a straight line increase, we'll probably continue to see the upticks and downticks.
It brings to mind the other question I had about the Sadowski fund. So tell me, I mean, the legislature has regularly robbed that, but there's a lot of questions in the last couple of years that they've now begun to start having us use that. So is that primarily where the money comes from in terms of the housing? Is that out of that Sadowski Act?
Yes, sir. And we had been in a good. The legislature had been gradually backing off of that sweep, and we had gotten. I think last year it was in the 135 million range. This year, we came back down to about 100. And I did not mention this in my presentation. There's tons of things you could talk about in the budget, but in this particular budget, what the legislature had been sweeping from trust funds was in the $300 million range. This past budget cycle, they swept $530 million in order to create another non-recurring general revenue pot. So sometimes when we talk about general revenue and other things, it can get kind of fuzzy, because once they take from one trust fund and put it in GR, it becomes something different.
Yeah.
I think, and I've encouraged everyone to be aware of the challenges that are up for next year and what this little blip in our economy or in our revenues are doing. But until we can get past it, we lost some of the momentum that we had in protecting the housing and some of the other dedicated funding sources that we have, because they reached in and we kind of taken a step back when it comes to trust fund sweeps.
A couple of quick questions. So let me ask Robert, if you don't mind. Put you back on the spot, Robert. I think I can do that. I have a little bit of history with you.
No pressure, Dad.
Okay, the $25,000 homestead exemption. I guess the real impact is, do you have any idea what the long-term impact on the city will be? I mean, I know it comes in for vote in 2018. Would go, I would assume, if approved, would go to impact our 2019
It would
tax
go into,
bill?
assume it's passed in November of 18, it goes into effect January of 19. So it
19.
would hit you sort of mid-year. I guess not quite mid-year.
Chris had an estimate, was it $3 million? $3 and $3.5 million.
$3.5 million impact. Okay, which is, you know, we're what about $128 million now in terms of ad valorem tax. 160. Okay, and it would have that. I mean, it wouldn't affect us for 2 calendar years. I guess we have to take advantage of it. Take into account the following budget year. Okay, good. But it goes on November, on the general election, November 2018. The second question is, Robert, I think I understood what you said, but I want to make sure. on the limitations on property tax assessment, the 60% required to repeal to remove any future repeal of that.
What and I may not have been clear when I wrote that, but what I meant by that is it's 60% to pass any constitutional amendment in Florida. So a 60% vote for that will remove what is right now in the Constitution is a 10-year sunset of that Save Our Businesses amendment. The Constitution amendment would remove that sunset, so it just stays in forever.
Okay,
The
so
no more than 10% increase annually.
So for us to go back to a natural progression of commercial property, we'd have to defeat that on, correct?
If it were to fail and not get 60% of the vote, then the sunset would remain. The legislature would, I think if my timing's right, have one more crack at putting it before the 10 years sunsetted, but if not, it would just come back to the ballot pretty quickly is my guess.
Okay.
But yeah, you would have to defeat that in order to have the sunset stay in the Constitution, meaning that it would stop being in effect 10 years after it was originally adopted.
So the second question along with is what's the financial impact of that to the city of Orlando? Any estimate, Mayor, as to if we go back to if we remove the 10%, what the impact is to the city?
I don't know.
Okay.
Because where it comes in is, let's say we have a recession, which we did, and property taxes dip, and then they recover, and they recover faster than whatever the 3% cap for Save Our Homes or 10% cap for commercial.
Right.
We can't recapture it as quickly.
Right.
Eventually, we probably recapture it, but it's over a number of years
Yeah.
rather than in a given year.
And we're a little bit there place now. That's the reason I was asking. All right, great. Thank you very much. And then there's one other question. I'll get to it in just a second. Allboard, Florida. So, Chris, the Allboard, Florida was having a lot of issues in Martin County, I think. Is that where it was, wasn't it? What does this do in terms of impacting that? Does this now give us them the go-ahead to start moving forward?
No, sir. It doesn't really deal with the permitting issues they're having on the Treasure Coast. This was simply the issue we had with Sunrail when you're operating on a government line and then you're also operating on a private CSX line is who has the liability for when your train is on that line. This would clarify that for All Aboard Florida because they will be using both a government line and a CSX private line. Same issue we had.
So the Martin County issue still is out there, still working on it?
Yes, sir.
From that standpoint.
Yeah.
All right. Well, let me just say everybody will say the same thing. Thank you for your work. The home rule issue is all of us sit up here and say, look, don't mess with our city. We know our city better than the state does. And so I won't tell you how much I appreciate that initiative and that focus on where our city's going. So thank you very much to the entire team. Thank you, Kathy, and for your leadership. I appreciate it. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Ortiz.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, Kathy, and thank you to this formidable team of lobbyists. Great job. The U.S. Constitution of the United States defines the duties of the federal government and the state government. Yet, our Constitution don't define the duties of the cities versus the state as defined, to where we can stop having to worry about the state trying to centralize the government. And this is what's happening right now. And I'm a little concerned because they're trying to take all the powers from the municipalities for us to legislate in terms of helping our cities and our communities. And that's a huge concern. It's a huge concern to the other 411 cities at the state. I just came back from a meeting with the Executive Board of the Florida League of Cities, and everybody's expressing the same concern. So, having said that, how can we utilize these great resources we have and put them together, I guess, with the other resources of the other cities to start lobbying our state government so we would define the parameters of where the state can come in so they stop violating our home rule?
I'm not sure I have that answer. The only thing I can say is with the House leadership, and it's not going to change anytime soon, they want less government, less regulation, and that is not changing, and they're
Well-
not easily to be deterred. The only way we have been able to impact on the issues we have is using a coalition of cities.
Well, we have the same problem. We want less government. We want less state government. Let us ourselves rule ourselves. And maybe, well, one of the biggest problems we're facing is that we keep sending people to Tallahassee, and no offense to anybody in particular, because we do have great people that have had great experience at the local level. But it seems like we keep sending people to Tallahassee who has no experience at the local level, and then they have to rule for us, or they have to come up with laws for us. And the same thing happens at the federal level, so what am I talking about?
Yes.
So anyhow, we need to make a greater effort to get to our constituents, so the voice of our constituents would get all the way up to the federal government and the state government in terms of knowing what's going on at those levels. So, and this is an effort on which each one of and every one of us have to take on in terms of supplying this information to our constituents, so our constituents know what our state and federal legislators are doing for us. They follow leadership. Every time I hear that, it just made me cringe. Because leadership, I thought they were the leaders of the community as they go to Tallahassee and try to defend the rights of our communities and what our communities need. Yet, they get to these levels and all of a sudden, everything turns around and they're following a different leadership because they're afraid of whatever. They put them in the basement or whatnot. Anyhow, let me ask you a couple of more direct questions here. All these different legislations that went under, is my understanding there was an agreement between the Speaker of the House and the Governor in terms to, for the Speaker would favor the funding for Enterprise Florida and Visit Florida, then he would turn around and help the Speaker in terms of the education, which is not a bad deal. It's definitely not a bad deal. But then again, he says it's going to be, it's my understanding, it's going to be a special legislative session to address some of those bills that were not, I just want to be clear about this, that were not addressed or went under because of this decision?
Technically, what they will address in the special session is what's in the call, which is my understanding, it's dealing with education and dealing with the economic development issues. And I think maybe one of them can talk better about the trade, but the Speaker wanted charter schools, about $200 million for charter schools. A lot of local educators hated that bill because they felt it was for private charter school companies out of state coming in, even though it was wrapped around these failing schools and schools of hope. But the governor agreed not to veto that, which there was a lot of pressure for him to do it. What he got in return is his economic development issues. What the Senate president wanted was these better goals for education, that we graduate more people and we graduate them in 4 years. And so what they did is they took all the pass-through money for projects that go under UCF in their economic development areas and vetoed all those. Every university got whacked. I talked to Dan Holzenbeck over UCF over the weekend. Their hit is $8 to $9 million. So those funds will be reallocated, I guess, some portion to economic development. I think the amount, they were saying $85 million. The rest will go into Senator President Negron's into higher education. So that's what's going on. Most the other legislators and us read it in the paper. So that's how we found out. So as John mentioned, there will be dissension because a lot of people committed other things to get what they got, and that's changed.
One last comment. We just increased the homestead exemption by $25,000. 25. Yeah, well, what I'm saying is it's in the process. But which is going to put a heavy, heavy burden on our cities. Yet we're against CRAs. which help us in our local, in our, localities to help our communities. Could somebody explain to me what's going on in Tallahassee in terms of common sense?
The reason I think there in South Florida, there are some CRA boards that are very independent, and they don't work well with their local governments. We don't have that case. And they have used CRA money through the years, maybe where there's not as much blight, is what they're calling a personal slush fund. So when you have a bad apple someplace, they create a statewide bill that will punish people that are doing a good job.
But aren't they, the local governments have, at the end of the day, have the last say on those CRAs? So I don't get why those two are not getting along down south.
Well, maybe I think now they might get along better. Bill, what do you think?
Hey, Commissioner.
Thank
There
you.
are some CRAs. The sense is that there are CRAs in the state who have finished their job, whose areas are no longer slum or blighted, but who won't go away. And the funds then are spent on things that are outside of what people would think of as appropriate for rehabilitating an area of town that needed it. And I think that that's an issue that has largely been a South Florida issue. It's one that can be addressed in the legislation, and we're talking to them about how to do that in a more sensible way. And I think we can get there. The pertinent question you ask is, can anybody tell you what's going on in Tallahassee? And the answer is no, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Peebles. Pensions. Anybody? No one talked about pensions this time. Did anything happen in Tallahassee about pensions?
I think on the state level, are they starting to do defined comp? But not with our pensions.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you once again, and I hope we can do something about that. Maybe put a huge group of people, a huge group of lobbyists all around the state to see if we can change the Constitution and define our roles as municipalities versus the roles of the state, and maybe we can amend the Constitution so we'll have more liberties to do what we need to do for our communities. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Ortiz. Back to Commissioner Hill.
Yes, Mayor, I just wanted, just for the sake of October, thinking out in October for council, with the $600,000 that you saw that was allocated with PKZ, actually it's going to be split between five?
Three or five. I don't know if
five.
we're
It's
sure
five.
yet. Yeah.
I want Lisa to come up because this is very important because the funding that we had been receiving for years was in the millions. That was split between three. Now we have 600,000 split between five, and there's going to be a large shortfall with funding for PKZ and all the programs that's there. So I would want the mayor and council to consider that on the upcoming budget.
Thank you, Commissioner. So last year we got 283,000 that was divided by three sites. This year, excuse me, 283 times three,
Got a million
850 divided by three. This year we have 600,000, and we don't know whether it's going to be divided by three or by five. And let me explain that. So there are two additional sites in the state of Florida that have now been designated as Florida Children's Initiatives. One is in Tampa. It's called Sulphur Springs Neighborhood of Promise. It's operated by the YMCA there. And there's now a second site in Miami in Overtown Children's Initiative. So there are now 5 children's initiatives, and the question is, will this money be divided by 5 or by 3? There was a companion effort going on in the legislature because there's a Florida statute that governs the establishment of children's initiatives, and at the moment that statute only defines 3 sites: Jacksonville, Orlando, and Miami Children's Initiative. And so we were trying to amend that statute to add the 2 additional sites, and it failed. So there's a question as to whether, since those 2 additional sites are not in state legislation, whether they will qualify to get a share of this money or not. So I don't know the answer to that right now. But it's still, despite that, it's still going to be a reduction from 283 last year to 200 this year for Orlando. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Hill. All right, Kathy, under the circumstances, good job by the lobbying team, and I don't think it's just Florida-based. I think there's a whole ALEC movement toward red states reigning in blue cities, and that's all over the country. You look at Texas and some of the Midwestern states, Western states, and they have the same preemption issues going on all over the country, and then the big companies find it easier to bypass us and just go straight to the legislature and tell us we can't regulate shopping carts being left in right-of-ways and things like that. So I don't think that's going to end anytime soon, and the House is going to continue to try to erode our local control. So we're going to be on defense, I think.
Yeah, Mayor, thank you. And I understand my colleagues' concern, but I've been doing it a long time too. And yeah, they've been dinging us time and time and time again. Even when we try to do good things, now they're coming after us just to be able to do CRAs, and it's been an onslaught, Commissioner. So I'm glad for your leadership at the state level, but I've been so frustrated with this. My silence is just my frustration. With this level of overstepping their authority.
If I may say something? You're right, and I think the frustration, just like you said, Mayor, we had a conference, the Southern States municipalities, and it was it was an eye-opener because everybody's going through the same thing.
Yeah.
But I think it's time for us to go back and utilize the power of the people. I mean, at the end of the day, it's our people the ones who vote. We need to make our people aware of what's going on and how this is affecting us. So we need to go back and we need to keep those lines of communications with our people really open so they know what's going on and how this is going to affect us if we don't do something about it. And teams like this formidable team that we have here, we need to also get you guys to help us out with this because you have a vast experience on how to lobby. So see how we can go ahead and get our people more involved in terms of what's going on in Tallahassee and in Washington, D.C. for that matter. Thank you.
My last thought on this is that I guess one of the measures the speaker had at the very beginning was to prohibit local governments from having lobbyists outside of city employees. And this is a pretty good example today of just why and how effective we need to be. A whole variety of different subjects that we need people with some expertise. And I don't even know what's on our agenda later today, but we hire, if you need a if you have a healthcare issue, you go to a doctor, right? If you need construction plans, you go to an engineer. If you need somebody that can help you with the legislative process, you go to the experts, and that's the government affairs folks that we have here that work for us today. So thank you, team.
Thank you.
Well, I want a standing ovation, but an ovation anyways. Okay, we will adjourn our public hearing for today. Thank you very much. Okay, we're going to convene the agenda review meeting of the Orlando City Council for June the 5th. Is there anybody from the public that would like to speak? There aren't many members from the public, but do we have any cards? Okay. Commissioner Gray, you're first up today.
Yes, sir. No issues on the agenda. I do need to declare conflict on the first two ordinances, 1 and 2. Ordinance 26 and 28 due to a business relationship, so I'll do the paperwork with the clerk before we meet at 2 o'clock.
Okay, and I should mention that item F1 has been pulled from the agenda. The paper agenda I have has it deleted already, but if you're using a more dated agenda, F1 will not be heard today. Okay, Commissioner Ortiz?
Nothing on the agenda, sir. Thank you.
Commissioner Stewart?
I think I'm okay.
Commissioner Sheehan?
I had a question, Mayor, and on item D1 on the John Mott house marker. Don't try to say that 3 times. I'm actually an applicant, so Kyle, do I need to recuse myself
Let
from
me talk to
voting
you
on that?
in between, and I don't think so, but let's chat and let me hear more of the facts before we make a decision on that.
Okay, and the only other thing I had was on the Public Art Advisory Board. There was a donation they accepted of 3 paintings that are actually in the rotunda from a local businessman, which was beautiful. He had them commissioned, and we only accepted 1 instead of all 3. I don't understand why the Public Arts Advisory Board only accepted 1, but I think in light of the fact that that businessman made that very generous donation with that, we definitely need to keep those paintings in our permanent collection. And if y'all want to see them, they're downstairs. They're really stunning. I mean, again, just a donation from a local businessman, Douglas Kegler. He lives in my district. He had them commissioned, and they're just beautiful. So I would like to, I appreciate the Public Art Advisory Board accepting 1, but I really think we need to accept all 3 of them as a donation. It's kind of insulting to say, after someone donates something to only accept 1. So that's the only concern I had on the agenda today. Thank you, Mayor.
Okay, thank you, Commissioner Sheehan. Commissioner Hill?
Yes, sir. I just wanted a follow-up question with Thomas Chapman on CRA 1.
Thomas, you got that? Okay, Commissioner Ings.
Thank you, Mayor. I have one concern reference the awards presentation recognition number 2, the proclamation itself. For the Orlando United Day, a day of love and kindness, and I think when we talk about the tragedy deeply impacted our LGBT, and I guess that's Latina and Hispanic communities. That
Latinx is probably what it says.
Say that again.
Latinx.
Yeah, I don't understand Latinx.
Oh, I'll help out with that, Mayor. There is a group within the Latino community that, because when you're Latina or Latino, it is a gender delineation. So they consider themselves gender fluid. So they call themselves Q-Latinx.
Okay.
It's just being sensitive to a subset of the LGBTQ community, and it also should say communities of color, because there were African Americans that were slaughtered at Pulse as well. And I've been fighting to make sure that we get all of the different groups recognized, but sometimes it doesn't make it into some of the different publicity, which is unfortunate, Commissioner, but I've been pushing for that and been criticized for it, but it is important.
Well, that's what I was going to say, that as we talk about these other communities,
Absolutely.
that it should include the African American community.
And I agree. It should say communities of color as well, Commissioner.
Yeah, there were impacts. So
Yes.
Can we get this amended, corrected, or added in?
We can add it in, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. And then the other thing, I'd like to see Byron Brooks reference items B4, B5, and this is in reference to the MWBE memo from that office reference MWBE projects. And that's all.
Okay, then we will stand adjourned and convene at 2 o'clock for our regular meeting.